Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most frustrating situations you're going to face as an elk hunter when you're in good country, putting in the effort, and there's absolutely no sign. No tracks, no droppings, no rubs, no bugles, nothing. And this is where a lot of hunts start to fall apart. Confidence drops, decisions get rushed, guys start bouncing from drainage to drainage, hoping to find something instead of understanding what's actually happening. But here's the truth a lot of elk hunters never fully grasp. A lack of visible sign doesn't mean a lack of elk. It usually means you're either out of sync with their timing, misreading how they're using the terrain, or hunting areas where elk just aren't leaving very much behind in the first place. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more consistent and successful elk hunter and outdoorsman. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to find elk when the mountain feels empty and how to stay in the game when most hunters mentally check out. One of the biggest mistakes elk hunters make is assuming the mountain is empty just because they're not seeing sign. And I understand why this happens. I've been there. We're conditioned to look for confirmation, tracks in the dirt, fresh poop, torn up ground, rubs. And when those things aren't there, it feels like you're wasting your time, right? But in my experience, a great way to reframe this is understanding that sign is only a snapshot, just a piece of where elk were, not where they are right now. Elk can move through an area pretty quickly and leave very little behind and not return for hours or even days, depending on pressure, weather, and feed rotation. You might be standing in a place elk used last night, but by the time you get there, it feels dead. Another piece a lot of hunters overlook is how conditions affect visibility of sign. Dry ground doesn't hold tracks all the time. Wind scatters scent and debris. Light use areas don't get torn up like heavily traffic zones that we want to find. So when it feels like nothing is often there, it's just low impact use. There are specific situations where elk can be in an area and leave almost no visible sign. And if you don't understand those, you're going to walk right past elk without ever realizing it. One of the most common is controlled movement. When elk aren't feeding aggressively or lingering, they travel pretty cleanly. Think about a herd moving from feeding area back to bedding at first light. They're not milling around, they're not tearing things up, they're walking with purpose, often on firm ground, side hilling through timber, or crossing rocky terrain that just doesn't hold tracks. Another situation is low pressure feeding. In certain areas, especially where feed is scattered instead of concentrated, elk don't need to stay in one spot for long. They take a few bites, they move, they take a few more, and they keep drifting like nomads. And that kind of behavior doesn't create the classic torn up look that a lot of hunters are trying to find. Weather plays a role too. Wind, moisture changes, and temperature swings, those can all erase and mute sign pretty quickly. A track that would be obvious in soft dirt can disappear completely in dry or frozen ground. So when you're not seeing sign, it doesn't automatically mean elk aren't using that area. It often means they're moving efficiently, they're feeding lightly, and leaving just enough behind that a lot of hunters never really recognize it. There are those areas on the mountain where elk consistently spend time, yet you'll rarely find the kind of sign that we're looking for, right? I call those invisible elk zones, and yet if you don't understand them, you're going to walk past some pretty prime country thinking it's dead. Those are typically transition zones that we've talked about before. I have whole videos on transition zones and how great they can be, especially when the elk aren't talking much. Think about shaded north-facing timber just below a ridge, or benches halfway down a slope, or loose travel corridors that connect feed to bedding. They could be traveling anywhere through that zone, right? Not on a tight trail. Elk use those places to move, stage, or pause, but not long enough to leave obvious evidence behind all the time. They're not feeding hard and they're not bedding for hours. They're simply using terrain efficiently. Another example is security edge, that thin line where thick cover meets more open terrain. Elk are often going to hug that edge, especially in pressured units, because it gives them visibility and an escape route at the same time. But again, they're not staying there long. In my experience, this is where a lot of mature bulls live during daylight, tight to cover, moving just enough and leaving almost nothing behind. If you only hunt where sign is obvious, you're going to miss those zones completely. But if you start identifying where elk should be based on terrain, not evidence, you're going to begin to find elk a lot of other hunters miss or don't even know are around. Most elk hunters are chasing sign, They're moving until they find tracks, poop, or rubs, and then they try to build a plan from there. The problem is, by the time you find that sign, the elk that made it are already gone. So, in my experience, a great way to reframe this is to stop thinking in terms of location first and start thinking in terms of time. Elk live on a daily rhythm. They feed during specific windows, transition during specific windows, and bed during specific windows. If you understand that timing, you can put yourself in the right place before elk ever show up without needing sign to confirm it. For example, instead of wandering a drainage looking for tracks mid morning, you should already be set up along a likely transition route between feed and bed. Not because you found sign there, but because the timing tells you elk have to pass through that transition zone somewhere. This is where a lot of elk hunters get out of sync. They hunt reactively instead of predictively. Sign tells you where elk were. Timing tells you where they're going to be. And when there's no sign, timing becomes your biggest advantage because you're no longer guessing, you're anticipating movement before it happens. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. There are certain terrain features that consistently move elk too, whether you see sign or not. And those are like natural funnels, places where the landscape limits options and quietly guides movement. And the mistake a lot of elk hunters make is waiting for tracks or poop to confirm what the terrain is already telling them. Elk don't move randomly across a mountain. They take the path of least resistance while still maintaining security. That often means side hilling on consistent elevation, using benches, slipping through saddles, or contouring just below ridge lines where they can move efficiently without exposing themselves. A bench halfway down a steep slope is a perfect example. Elk use it because it's easier to travel, but they may only pass through once or twice a day. That doesn't leave a lot of sign, but it doesn't mean it's not a high value location. Same thing with subtle saddles or narrow contour lines between two drainages. Elk are going to naturally funnel through those areas, especially during those transition times. If you wait for sign to validate those spots, you're going to overlook them. But when you start trusting terrain over evidence, you're going to begin hunting movement instead of leftovers, and that's where your consistency starts to build. Two of the biggest factors that make elk feel invisible are wind and hunting pressure. And most hunters don't realize how much those two forces not only move elk, but erase the evidence that they were even there. Wind dictates how elk use terrain, right? We talked about that a ton. In unstable or shifting wind conditions, elk avoid lingering in exposed areas or places where scent control is unpredictable. They move through quickly, choose tighter cover, and spend more time in locations where the wind is consistent and readable for them. That kind of behavior doesn't leave much sign because they're not relaxed, they're alert and efficient. Pressure amplifies that even more. Once elk start encountering hunters, they're going to shift into survival mode. They travel quieter, they spend less time feeding in open areas, and they move during lower risk windows. They're going to favor terrain that allows quick escape, limited visibility, visibility and wind advantage. Again, that leads to minimal disturbance on the ground. What a lot of elk hunters interpret as no elk is often just pressured elk behaving a little bit differently than they hope for. In my experience, a great way to reframe this is to understand that when sign appears, it's usually a signal, not that elk are gone, but that they've tightened up, they've moved smarter, and they're using the mountain in a way that leaves very little behind. And this is the point in a hunt where a lot of guys fall apart, and it has nothing to do with skill, it's confidence. When you've gone hours or even days without seeing sign, hearing elk, or getting any kind of feedback, it starts to mess with your head. You begin second guessing your location, your decisions, even your ability. And that mental spiral leads to the worst possible outcome. You abandon good country too early. Trust me, I understand this can be tough. So, my recommendation would be to shift your focus from results to a process. Ask yourself, am I in the right type of terrain for this time of day? Is the wind in my favor? Am I positioned where elk should move, even if I haven't seen proof yet? If those answers are yes, then you're probably not lost, you're just early. Elk hunting has long stretches of silence. That's just part of the game. And the hunters who stay consistent are the ones who trust their decisions even when the mountain gives them nothing back. But if you stay disciplined, stay in position, and keep hunting with intent, you give yourself a chance when the moment finally shows up, and it always does for the guys who don't quit. When there's no sign, no sound, no confirmation, you need a system, not hope. And this is where consistent elk hunters separate themselves because they don't rely on feedback alone to make decisions, they rely on structure. The first step is committing to time blocks. Instead of wandering all day, you break your hunt into phases: morning transitions, midday positioning, evening movement. Each phase has a purpose, and you place yourself accordingly, whether you've seen sign or not. Next is terrain-based decision making. You're not asking, where did I find tracks? You're asking, where should elk move right now? And that's going to keep you anchored to logic instead of emotion. Then you layer in discipline. You give each area enough time to play out. You don't bail after an hour just because it feels quiet. Most opportunities happen after long stretches of absolutely nothing. And finally, you eliminate randomness. Every move you make has a reason: wind, timing, terrain, or pressure. And in my experience, this is the shift. When you stop chasing confirmation and start running a system, you don't need sign alone to find elk. You become the one who finds them anyway. When the mountain feels empty, a lot of hunters assume the hunt is over. They start covering ground without direction or chasing sign that isn't there, and slowly lose confidence with every step. But the reality is, this is where the hunt actually begins. Because when there's no sign, no noise, and no obvious answers, you're forced to rely on understanding instead of evidence. You have to trust terrain, timing, wind, and pressure instead of hoping for confirmation. And that's what separates consistent elk hunters from everybody else. They don't need the mountain to tell them elk are there. They already know where elk should be, and they hunt accordingly. If you can stay disciplined when things feel empty, if you can make calculated decisions without feedback, you're going to start finding elk in places where other hunters walk right past. And once you understand that, you're never really hunting blind again. You're just operating at a level that a lot of hunters never reach. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I've got a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution, all in real terrain. 90% of Elk Camp is going to be running real hands-on scenarios. You can check out Elk Camp at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication with me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.